Working in a busy London hospital with a triage ward where patients are admitted in crisis, my small music psychotherapy team are often faced with patients who are experiencing an inpatient stay for the first time, and their suspicion, rage, elation is palpable. A musical improvisation can be a way of engaging patients in this state and having a manageable contact. But managing basic boundaries around continuity and confidentiality demand much energy on the therapist's part, and even getting to a space where something might happen is a major part of the work. The tensions involved in collecting patients in elated, aggressive or paranoid states without overt collusion with the patient's pathological organisation requires very real skill. Once in the therapy space, the assault on the therapist's capacity to think, to have their own mind, continues. One patient I saw over several years, initially on the intensive care unit at the hospital, on entering the music therapy room for the first time, immediately became lost in an idealized vision of the hospital being a spaceship flying through the vacuum of space. He sung as he played, all the instruments I made available, often several at once, in a greedy, merged state, about the community of love that might sustain him through dark, empty space, and then moments later described his rage at a gross intrusion into this narcissistic, omnipotent and infantile state as people, or part objects, came in and destroyed his right to exist. I think this is a clear example of Steiner's conceptualization of Klein's original idea of the paranoid schizoid position, in which idealization and denigration follow in this quick succession. But clearly also the patient was describing something I talked about in the second podcast on music psychotherapy, a problem with his psychic skin. In this case, torn, broken, possibly never fully formed, in which his identity remained incredibly fragile, susceptible to small environmental triggers that kept him trapped in the refractory cycle of short spells in the community and much longer spells in hospital. His need to retreat was palpable. I wasn't allowed to play. I was to listen, record and praise his work, which he imbued with much magical significance and a grossly inflated sense of aesthetic worth. But as our sessions continued, often without space to think as one very similar piece followed the last, I began to notice patterns in our interactions such as it was. At one point I managed to find the space to ask him why I wasn't tolerated musically, why he couldn't share an improvisation with me. And his response was very clear. My genius destroyed him. He collapsed every time I made a coherent musical statement. My modest musical skill in actuality then was being idealized, and this was triggering both shame at his perceived worthlessness, at its root an annihilatory threat to his very existence, and then envious attacks on my mind within his fantasy as he attempted quite successfully to obliterate me. I noticed when I made an interpretation about this and explained as empathically as I could what I thought he was struggling with, his response was more music at a much faster pace that included more chaos, more distortion, more volume. In this way, he attacked his own music in an attempt to stop any links of meaning being formed in his mind. We began to meet twice weekly, partly as a result of his insatiable greed, but his very genuine excitement about coming kept him up all night, so that come the time of the session, he was often asleep. However, trust did develop and progress occurred. He described on one occasion how God and the devil were in league, and what chance did the world have? And I was able to interpret that the world, in fact, was him, and he was struggling with what he thought he should be, God, the superego, and his own aggression, the devil, which he was very afraid of. His response was to tell me that he could breathe down here in the music therapy room. I think we can see in this patient's expression evidence of a combined object, that God and the devil are good and bad, conjoined in a way where the patient or the patient's ego cannot make any headway. The patient's internal world is being ruled now by a pathological organization. Sometimes he now came just to talk, having been discharged from the inpatient service, and I found that his staying up very late related directly to his relationship to his father, who had worked unsociable hours, and his fragile idealization of his father caused a very powerful envious reaction that his father was incapable of understanding. Musically, this period was marked by his singing songs he knew and allowing me to accompany them on the guitar. These songs conveyed a melancholic mood and, being lyrical, much analyzable material about his internal and external objects. It was this process of accepting the retreat and empathizing with his very real need for it that allowed space for ego growth, where his identity was so fractured and intermittent that it was destroyed moment by his own envy and shame. And then over time, developing trust that could evolve a kind of space in which to think, that then allowed a nostalgia and mourning to begin, marking a move from his retreat to the depressive position. John Steiner says, if mourning can be worked through, the individual becomes more clearly aware of a separateness of self and object, and recognizes more clearly what belongs to the self and what belongs to the object. When such separateness is achieved, it has immense consequences, because along with it go other aspects of mental function, which we associate with the depressive position, including the development of thinking and symbol formation. I have found that by recognizing the epic dimension of the patient's emotional world while being presented with the deadening of creativity or the denial of feeling, coupling this with a genuine musical attunement of the patient's powerfully expressed or deathly quiet affect, this pairing allows the patient to feel very quickly understood at a fundamental level. Facilitating the enhancement of the patient's creativity is a worthy goal in music psychotherapy, and yet much more difficult than one might imagine to achieve. Creativity, for example, is not manic fusion. This may well be fantasy-rich, but is an enactment by therapist and patient, something we are often engaged with in the early encounter with a patient. The material remains uncontained while only a kind of mirroring takes place, and the hidden feelings that need representing to restore balance to the patient's psyche remain locked in the therapist's silent countertransference. Now, if a music class were possible, I would happily turn hospitals into universities. But as anyone who has walked a mile down this road will explain, psychosis, from a psychoanalytic standpoint, is an attack on meaning. And so the epistemophilic impulse that Klein described and Bion later called K cannot easily flower into genuine creativity. To explain, the epistemophilic impulse is the desire to learn about the world from early infancy onwards. First, the desire to experience mother's body and then her mind and its contents, and the baby then uses this as a blueprint for further exploration of the world and its wonders. Now, shame can destroy this K-link. Envy of an overproductive therapist keen to show their skill can delay or even destroy the possibility of these first faltering steps in this direction. Anxiety stimulated by a lack of continuity or too much change, on the other hand, can further impede this process. It might also be worth considering that genuine creativity is about working within constraints to achieve new connections and further new form. And this speaks, I think, to the value of boundary setting and of manageable disappointment. In other words, a move from a retreat in which anything is possible but nothing exists, or a paranoid schizoid position in which no continuity can be maintained, to the depressive position where loss can be managed, old patterns can be let go of, and we might allow space without being overpowered by annihilatory anxiety for new forms to emerge.